While we're talking about Amazon, ayahuasca,
Yes.
psychedelics, yes, and how they tie into
These myths and
Yeah.
in ancient civilization and potentially using the knowledge or experience gained from these psychedelic drugs to maybe build these huge megalithic structures.
Yeah.
How big a role do you think psychedelics have played in prehistory?
Well, it's one of the reasons why we should never look for ourselves in the past, because we've had the horrific, vicious, evil thing called the war on drugs for the past 50 plus years, which is gradually going away, thank God. You know, but we're a culture that's hated psychedelics since the time of Richard Nixon, and we kind of just assumed that every culture in antiquity also hated psychedelics. No, they didn't. They were deeply involved with psychedelics. Whether you're talking about the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece,
What's that?
It was a temple, the Temple of Eleusis. It stands just outside of Athens in Greece, what's left of it. They served up a potion to all the initiates. And the initiates included Sophocles, Pindar, Plato himself. All the great minds of ancient world went to Eleusis. They were given this brew, which was called the kykeon. Then they went down into these deep chambers underneath the Temple of Eleusis. And then they had extraordinary experiences, which gave them revelations about the nature of reality. They ceased to fear death. They knew that they knew that death was not the end. They had no fear of death anymore after they'd had this experience. Sounds a lot like a psychedelic experience. And then we have the work that's been done on that brew. And that brew was made, we're told it was made from barley, mint, and water. But what grows on barley is Claviceps paspali, which is an LSD-like fungus.
Love it. I love it.
Which is soluble in water. There are ergots that are very dangerous, but there are
Ergots?
Ergot. Ergot is the class of fungus to which this belongs.
Okay.
And some of them are extremely dangerous. But this one is soluble in water, is not dangerous, and is basically LSD. They were drinking LSD in the Temple of Eleusis, and they were having revelations about the meaning of life, and they were creating great philosophy and brilliant ideas at the time. It's of course massively connected to this surge of intellectual activity in ancient Greece. But ayahuasca.
Or even before we get to ayahuasca, what were we discussing earlier? Is the pineal gland that you see represented in like as the pine cone? I saw it when I was in the Vatican. There's like this pine cone.
There's one at the Vatican. They're pictured in many of the Mesopotamian reliefs that show the seven sages. They're holding a pine cone to somebody's head, you know.
Yeah.
There's a suggestion that the pineal gland, it has been suggested that the pineal gland secretes dimethyltryptamine.
DMT.
DMT. I think that the more recent work on that suggests it probably doesn't, but that it's a locus for endogenous. All of us have DMT in our bodies. We're all illegal here.
Yeah, we're all carriers.
We're all carriers. It's a natural brain hormone.
Yeah.
The exact question of where in the body it's generated, some people think it might be the lungs these days. Wherever it is, it's there.
Yeah.
And the pineal is associated with it in a number of ways, and it's associated. The pineal is the third eye. It was an eye. The pineal was an eye. It still is in some amphibians.
That's why it's called the third eye.
It has a lens, a cornea, and a retina.
We've just evolved out of it.
Yeah, it's gone deeper into the brain. It's no longer light sensitive, but it's still arguably the third eye. So the connection of the pineal and DMT is not absolutely clear, but there is likely some connection.
Okay, so the idea of us looking for ourselves in the past, we're looking at how people build the pyramids, and we're going, well, you know, we have these cranes. Where are your cranes?
Where are your cranes? Yeah.
Instead of looking for the things that we are not utilizing, that they may utilize, which are psychedelic drugs, and maybe that gave them access to. It's stupid to use the word powers because I think it kind of dismisses everything, but maybe they give them access to some sort of like otherworldly knowledge that could have helped them create.
Well, it's an interesting discussion, actually.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about psychedelics, one of the many interesting things about psychedelics is for a start, new evidence that's emerging from scientific studies. At last, psychedelics have been taken out of the closet and are being examined for their therapeutic potential. And one of the things that it's very clear that psilocybin definitely does is...
That's mushrooms.
Mushrooms,
Yeah.
which is closely related to DMT. It's a kind of orally edible, orally ingestible form of DMT. They promote neuroplasticity. They cause new neurons to grow in the brain. They make us smarter. Let us pay great tribute to Terence McKenna, a brilliant thinker in this field, whose stoned ape hypothesis and whose book, The Food of the Gods, was one of the early recognitions that psychedelics may have been the trigger that took our ancestor out of millions of years of boredom and put them on the path that we recognize as modern humanity.
Yeah.
It's a perfectly reasonable thing. Also, the way that psychedelics are very helpful with depression is very interesting. And why is that the case? Depression, and I speak from experience because I've suffered myself from a long period of depression back in the early 90s. Depression is a very narrow, rigid frame of mind, where you get locked into recurring patterns of thought and they're very negative, and you keep on repeating them to yourself, and you start hating yourself, and you just can't bear anything, and you're locked, and you can't escape from it. And what psychedelics seem to do is that they break that pattern. They just break it completely. And in this case, for depression, what seems to work best is a massive dose rather than microdosing. Microdosing is great as well.
You have to snap yourself out of it.
You've got to snap yourself out of it. Get out of that
there's
pattern.
also, like, I think in depressive states, there's a narcissism wrapped into it.
Maybe
And
so, yeah.
Not a narcissism in terms of, like, I'm the best, look at me, everything's about me, but in the negative side of that.
It's all
which
about
is-
you still.
Yeah.
It's just...
And that constant negative thought. But taking and having a psychedelic experience will make you realize maybe how small you are in the grand scheme of things, or how you are intertwined into the fabric of humanity, so it can break out of that. Yeah, I like
Ego
that.
death will disconnect you from the universe conspiring against you.
Yeah. Exactly.
You're not that important.
And if you belong to a species that has been making the same kind of stone tool without any changes for more than 1 million years, two things are happening. Clearly, cultural information is being passed down, and clearly you're locked in a very narrow frame. And then suddenly it changes, and our ancestors start producing this extraordinary cave art, this amazing cave art. Whether you're talking about that site Serrania de la Lindosa in Colombia, or whether you're talking about Lascaux Cave in France, the art is stunning. And it is classically psychedelic art. It is featuring geometry, patterns of swirling dots, zigzag lines. There's Serrania de la Lindosa, and there's one of the extinct Ice Age megafauna with the arrow pointing at it up there. The geometry that's in there, the swirling dots, the sort of interlinked chains that are shown out there on the left. These are all classic psychedelic visions. Very often, as people enter a deeply altered state of consciousness, it starts with geometry and patterns, and then it manifests more into entities. And those entities are often therianthropic in form, Greek therion, wild beast, anthropos, man. They're part human, part animal in form. Not something that you see every day, but something that is
very common in
frequently common, very common in Egyptian art, and very, very common in deeply altered states of consciousness brought on by psychedelics, is the encounter with entities who then appear to communicate with us. And again, this is where the archaeologists roll their minds, because they like to think that consciousness is entirely local to the brain. It's all manufactured by the brain, and this is just our brain on drugs. Whereas in fact, the opposite seems to be true. The brain seems to be acting as a receiver for consciousness rather than as a manufacturer of consciousness.